Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to a new episode of The Local Lens, a podcast from the Powell County Health Department where we go inside our community's experience with the drug epidemic. This show is coming to you from Stanton, Kentucky, a small town nestled at the foothills of Appalachia. The entire goal of our show here is to gather as many unique perspectives on the drug problem as possible, and gather all of those perspectives into conversations and then show those conversations to you guys. So today we were lucky enough to have Miss Lisa Coffey and Miss April Smith join our show. These two ladies have been working around addiction for several years now, and they're coming from a therapeutic counseling kind of background. The two of them have a lot of personal experience working with people who are both in addiction and in recovery. So their perspectives are pretty incredible for this show. So Lisa now works in a different job, but I'll explain that to you later on. And also my apologies, we recorded this episode while there was a raging Kentucky summer thunderstorm going on, so please be graceful and forgive us of that. Well, let's go on and get into the show. This is The Local Lens. I'm your host, Nate Brooks. These are our people using our voices, telling our stories, because no one sees it like we do. Yeah, this is a pleasure to have you guys here. So just one at a time, if you guys would like to introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Okay, so my name is April Smith, and I work at the Montgomery County Health Department, but I'm employed through UK Healthcare as a risk reduction specialist. And over there, my role works with a lot of those vulnerable populations, people who are at risk for contracting HIV and Hep C, providing testing and connections to treatment. Yeah, so that's what I do. And then in my spare time, my husband and I, we run Celebrate Recovery here in Clay City, and that's a big passion of mine as well.
My name's Lisa Coffey, and I would call myself a friend of recovery before anything else. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so my profession and trade is mental health and addiction counseling. I work at Shepherd Shelter Ross Rehab 3 days a week and do private practice. And I partner with the Celebrate Recovery program and the Spark Ministries program, helping out with both of those in any way that I can. But I just have a really strong passion about helping people, and addiction is one of the populations of people that I have always been really drawn to for lots of reasons. So that's what I'm here for.
If you guys put like a number of years on how long you guys have been like directly involved with this whole fight?
So when I started my career in social work in 2004, I was a child protective service worker in Lexington. And a large number of the cases that we worked were linked to addiction. So in the beginning, it was just working with families and children that were affected and impacted by addiction, and communities that were affected by addiction. And then I believe it was 2011, my ex-brother-in-law passed away, and it was drug-related. And it really sparked a passion and an interest in me to understand more about him. And I began to study and train and do everything I could to learn about addiction. So, and then I got connected with Spark in 2015, I believe, and then Celebrate Recovery came on the heels of that, and so it's been a while for me, but probably since 2004 for sure I've seen the impact of addiction on some level, whether it was in a family or an individual, and worked within that to try to help. So
yeah. And then just a quick note on that too with Spark. You mentioned Spark. Spark is oh man, there's a thunderstorm right outside, and I'm sure that's going to be heard on this. But, so Spark is it's a local nonprofit group, people working with recovering folks, and I remember when I was in high school, they were starting to come out, and they were starting to host some more events around the city, and Spark was responsible for like some of my introduction to the whole thing going on.
So mine is going on 4 years. It was something I wasn't searching out. It kind of found me. And when I got into it through Celebrate Recovery and began to educate myself, I was like, oh wow, this is amazing what people are doing to help those in addiction. So through Celebrate Recovery, it's going on 4 years.
So the two of you guys paired together kind of make a really interesting approach to this because I know Lisa, your specialty is like how the addiction like affects your brain and all that, and then Miss April, your specialty is how like that kind of should form how we approach it and like how we approach the people that are dealing with it, because it really isn't it's very tricky. It's very tricky, and it's a new idea for a lot of people and for me as well. So whatever we get into today is going to be teaching me just as much as it's teaching anybody else that's listening to.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can go on and get into it then. Lisa, would you like to talk a little bit about like how exactly it how the addiction affects your brain and all that?
Sure. So one of the things that I hear a lot in working with people in addiction is family members, friends, people in the community often saying things like they don't even want to get better, they don't even, care anymore about people who are suffering with addiction. But also just that's not who I thought that person was. That's not the person that I knew. That's not my son. That's not my daughter. And a lot of times, in that, I just agree and say, you're exactly right. That's not the person that you once knew or the person that you know is in there. Mm-hmm. But I really liken it to medical conditions because as with every medical condition that we can list, there are organs in our body that are affected and impaired. And with addiction, initially it's very much a choice. Many would say it's a very bad choice that people make. They don't think it through. Some people do it for social reasons. Some people do it because they honestly don't want to feel anything and they want to just numb their life for the moment. But for whatever reason, they choose that. And within weeks to months, depending on the frequency of use and what type of drug they're using, their brain is chemically changed, and their brain actually triggers a response in their central reward center of their brain telling them they need these chemicals mm-hmm. to be able to function. Just like we think we need air and we think we need, mm-hmm. Drink and food, because our brain tells us that subconsciously. And that's what those urges and cravings that people experience in addiction really can be likened to. The similar thing of like urges or cravings for hunger or thirst. Mm-hmm. And they're that intense and they're that real for people.
So very basically, the problem comes from there being a chemical change in your brain, and that chemical change causes all sorts of other problems.
And so with that chemical change comes just this impairment within all of the other processes that our brain is designed to do for us. Just like, our heart has a function, our brain has a function, and unfortunately, Nate, our brain is in control of all of it. Mm-hmm. So it affects us health-wise, physically, and it affects us in our decision-making capacity. And the big piece that I try to cover with people is the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is that executive functioning in our brain where we make decisions based on risk and benefit and pros and cons. That part of our brain is very clouded and chemically altered to the degree that it's not functioning. Mm-hmm. So people are not making a responsive decision. They're making a very reactive choice, if you can call it that. Sometimes I struggle to call it a choice because it's so reactive to those urges and cravings. And the other parts of the brain that are impaired and affected by the chemical flow is, our emotional reasoning really can be heightened by certain substances. And so not only is it unhealthy for people to make an emotionally driven decision without any logic for any of us, but with this, it's intensified. And so those emotional reasoning functions of our brain can be really intensified in those moments and just add to that impulsivity. And it really comes down to they're seeking that instant gratification over and over and over again. And in the beginning, that's fun and that's real, and that's, people will say the best thing I've ever experienced.
It's exciting.
Yeah, there's excitement there and there's pleasure there, and all the things you can imagine that are good and the feelings you've had to the most intense level is what a lot of people have described that to me. So a lot of times people tell me they must like it, but when I interview people who are in addiction, they never say, I really like this. They're more saying, I need help, like I'm miserable. I have to get up and use something to be able to get up. I can't function without this.
Yeah.
And that level of dependence is really unimaginable to me on anything. But they have that level of dependence on that chemical or that substance and that alteration of the brain that they've become so familiar with.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you say at that point there's no pleasure in almost anything? Not just the drug, but like what brings us pleasure in life, it isn't there anymore.
So the normal things that bring people pleasure, like hobbies or family or just activities that we really find enjoyment in, whatever those are for each person, those things become a sidebar and eventually don't even exist anymore in these people's lives because they're so lost in that instant, intense gratification that comes with that stimulating of the brain, with the chemical flow, that April's right. I mean, there's basically there's no high like that. And I believe that from interviewing people. You know, they compare it to all kinds of things that give us pleasure, but that intense level of pleasure, in my belief system, I don't think we're ever supposed to ever really experience that in a healthy, normal, sober life. I don't think we're supposed to experience that intensified level of instant gratification. But once it's there, they seek that out repeatedly. And they lose sight of any other thing that mattered or that they ever thought was pleasurable or enjoyable, seeking that higher high.
And that's where it comes in, like I've heard people say, well, if they would just look at their children, aren't their children's faces enough for them to motivate them to, get right? But at that point, it isn't, because that's not something that, it's not like you can compare it to something that a sober mind would think or feel.
So at that point, your head is working differently than it was before the substances were introduced. And it's really almost unrecognizable, like, what the decision-making process is from a sober mind, because the two just operate with such different drivers at that point. I'm going to ask, kind of specifically, what are the substances that do really have the strongest changes towards your brain?
Meth.
Well, so they all have a different effect, but the opiates, which is the pills, the Loratab, the Percocet, the Oxycontin, the heroin, methamphetamines has a totally different effect, but it's very intense, and it also brings about that euphoria in a different way that people just continue to seek out that high. They all have the high, of course, but meth to me is probably one of the most detrimental substances that I see, because not only does it give that instant gratification and that really intense high, it also brings about a lot of hallucinations that are just, euphoria mixed with those hallucinations. And a lot of times I've seen people have a psychotic episode from meth use and the level of meth that they've gotten to the place where they're using. And a few people I've worked with, unfortunately, haven't fully been able to recover from some of those psychotic symptoms that they experienced that were once substance-induced, but maybe because of the intensity of the psychotic episode, it led to further mental illness.
Changed that chemical makeup in the brain.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think that, we have our brain has a normal flow of chemicals, and we've all heard of somebody saying, well, they're chemically imbalanced and they need, this supplement to help with depression or, to alter that anxiety response. And those kind of medicines are helpful sometimes for people to find a chemical balance that they can operate in a more healthy way with. But these kind of illicit substances were never designed to use, not just to use recreationally, but also at the pace and the frequency and the tolerance level that some people develop over time, because they're just seeking that high over and over, and eventually that runs out and they have to use more to get that. And that's another big component of addiction is, that amount that they started with has changed drastically by the time they're in full-blown addiction, and it's much increased, and they continue to increase it because they want that feeling. And the reality of where they are emotionally is that they are stunted. They don't process their emotions. They don't feel their emotions. Like what April was saying, they don't have those normal, natural responses that we would have to life events or situations. Yeah. Those are masked very much by a chemical flow.
And to me, hearing that, that's very surprising, because how could somebody just not be emotional? But then that's when you have to check Lisa's credentials and trust that she knows what she's doing. She knows what she's talking about. So trust her.
And the way I think that people are using the drugs has changed. Over the last year or so, we've seen more injection with meth, which you really typically, we didn't think of meth as something that was injected, but now we're seeing that, and meth is being mixed with fentanyl, which is a deadly combination.
And if you hadn't heard of fentanyl, that is bad stuff.
So in 2018, 3/4 of the overdose deaths in Kentucky was due to fentanyl, usually injection, or some sort of, ingesting it in some manner. But it is a very dangerous drug, yes.
And fentanyl is kind of mixed along with another drug. It's like it's paired with it, and
it's so strong that it's usually mixed with. It can be mixed with marijuana, heroin, meth, and it's just bad news. But one of the reasons that we do see meth so much is like heroin or fentanyl, any of the opiates, that comes from the poppy plant, so there's like a growing season. But with meth, it's just made year-round. There's nothing to stop that production. So it's just constantly being pumped out into our communities. And it's so readily available and affordable.
Yeah. So once somebody does enter that whole cycle and they start using, and some of your chemicals start getting thrown off, about how long on average would you say it takes to either reverse it or learn to deal with it? Like how does that process look?
So that's tricky, because the brain does heal itself, which is amazing. And I just want to give my little plug, and then I'll hand it over to Lisa, because she's an expert on this matter. But what's hard about it is it takes between 18 months to 2 years for that recovery to happen, but that is if there's no relapses. So when you factor relapses in there, then that just extends that time out. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. So there's some healing that occurs within the first 30 to 90 days of recovery. Minimal is what I would say. That's really just getting your brain back to a place where you're starting to feel some of the emotions and have some of the mental processing that typically would occur in a sober mind, because you're just getting out of that detox phase, and the chemicals are really just leaving your system at that point. And then as you increase to 120 days all the way up to 12 months to 18 months, really where we see the most success start to shift statistically is if somebody can get 2 years of sobriety.
Yes.
So that 24-month mark is a huge point. And April's right. If there's relapse in between there, it's not that person in their recovery journey has to say, I've only been in recovery for a day now because I relapsed yesterday. But really the scientific research shows that every time you reignite that central reward center with those chemicals, it's a huge setback for the functioning of the brain, again, because of the instant gratification. And then that impulsivity almost comes from that. So it causes that person to almost be revved up again in that cycle of urges, cravings, and maybe triggers are more intense. So it's definitely a fact that the brain does heal itself with time.
Yes.
And when you look at that time frame, I think it's a little different for everybody, because everybody's method of use is different. Everybody's frequency of use is different. The length of time they've been in addiction is different. So the damage done is different for each person. So then, therefore, that healing process can look very different for each person as well. But the statistics really do show between 12 and 24 months, a significant amount of clarity, focus, the ability to have goal-driven thoughts, and that motivation of a more healthy emotional and mental process can come back. So.
And that's great news. And I please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Casey's Law you can get treatment ordered for like 60 to 360 days.
Yes.
Which at a maximum is like 1 year.
Yeah.
And so if a family were to go through with Casey's Law then, and they were in a year of treatment and they see it's going really well, would that next year, would that still be some kind of like, is there a way to involuntarily add that, like that they could go on and continue that for another year, or how would that look?
That has happened with a few of the cases that we've seen. If a family member still continues to have that concern, they can obviously file the petition again, and some judges will allow them to extend it based on a petition that they've already filed. In those cases, it's mostly because the individual who's actually getting the treatment is there and more open to the idea of extending that time.
Okay.
I've seen a few people say to the judge themselves, I've been doing well for a year and I'm concerned about losing this accountability, so could we extend it for a longer period of time? Very few cases, but that has happened. And they typically do. They can. I mean, the way the Casey's Law petition works, you can file a new one anytime that you have a concern that someone has addiction, has a problem, and needs that help. So
it can be very frightening for the person who maybe they finished a year of treatment and all of a sudden they have this newfound freedom and that level of accountability is gone. So that's a really good point to make, and I think it's something that families as well as the person receiving the treatment needs to think about.
So it seems like no matter what's happened, people, like, your brain is on a path, and like an unchanged brain is going on just like some straight path, and the more chemicals that shouldn't be there that you introduce to it, the further you stray off from that path. And you can still definitely come back to that original path, but like it just takes a lot of time and a lot of work, right?
It does. And one thing I want to say that I don't think people often think of, but like getting enough sleep, nutrition, exercise, having purpose in your life, those things all speed up that healing process. Because if, say, you're not taking the drugs anymore, but you're running on caffeine and cigarettes, your brain doesn't have what it needs to heal as quickly. So I just want people to think about that wholeness, you know, of let me get 6 to 8 hours of sleep, you know, so that my brain can rest and regenerate, and put healthy foods in my body and not be on an emotional roller coaster all the time. So those all work together.
And I'd like to widen that to like everyone.
Yes.
We can all like start sleeping better and eating better and all that, then we'll probably see a lot of the health issues that we face today.
I think the other thought that I would add there is with addiction, probably within the first 12 to 18 months, this person is chemically getting to a healthier place in their brain for sure. If they're doing these added things that April just suggested, their success rate almost it's double, because they're getting the things that we need as a human to be healthy. And that wholeness that they get in their health, mind and body, that connection strengthens that ability for the brain to heal in a better way. But the other part of addiction that people can relate to really but forget is there is the chemical dependence, but there's also the habits that are formed that come along with addiction. It's not just the chemical reaction that drives those impulsive, instant gratification, reactive decisions. It's the lifestyle. It's a constant. When you hear someone really tell their true story of what their day was like in addiction, it is exhausting to hear. It's just like, whoa, you wake up with that one thing in your mind. It's an obsessive, compulsive type behavior that happens. And those habits that come along with that have to be broken. And I think one of the things that we struggle with, even in recovery work, is we can get people clean. We see it every day. We can get people sober, but there's a difference between sobriety and full recovery.
Yes.
The sobriety is the chemical dependence piece is being treated by the sober period, without that access to the drug or the alcohol. But then you have to help that person make change, and we all can relate to change being a difficult thing. As humans, in our nature, we get this routine going, and we don't really easily veer off of that. And so we have to relate to them in a way of, they're making a lot of changes. They're changing the people they associate with. They're changing the places they allow themselves to be, the things that they involve themselves in. that is all that's a necessity for them to get their recovery going, not just sobriety, but their recovery. And I think sometimes what gets lost in compassion for people who are suffering with addiction is we forget that they're human. They aren't going to be able to make all of these leaps and bounds overnight. They didn't come to this place of sickness because it's truly, they're just ill. They're very ill when they're in this active addiction stage. They didn't come to this place overnight. They didn't make it to where they are at a loss for everything. Because if you really talk to a person in addiction and they're trying to get their sobriety, they'll tell you, I've lost everything. I don't have any hope. I don't have my mental clarity. I don't have a job. I don't have a family. I don't even trust myself right now. They're at the lowest of low, and then we're looking at them saying, there is hope, and what you have to do to get this going for yourself is make these massive changes in every area of your life. And that alone would be daunting for most humans to make those kind of changes.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, like, it makes me think of just, like, when COVID hit and, like, the world was shut down, and, like, that's something every one of us, like, experienced. And that's to a minor degree. That was just, like, what you spend your immediate time doing.
So, yeah, change is hard. So think back to March and April of 2020 when everything that you were used to doing was suddenly just thrown off and you weren't able to do what you were used to doing anymore. Then you can kind of get a sense at how rattling it is to change every aspect of your routine.
I think we have to get to a place where we make it relatable on any scale that we can. April's very good at talking about the language of addiction recovery and being a friend of recovery. But we have to get to a place where we don't sweep things under the rug and not bring up the fact that we see this epidemic right before our eyes in our communities every day. And I think some efforts in communities do tend to want to minimize that there's a problem, and that's problematic in itself because the whole community's suffering from this addiction thing. Whether you're in addiction or you're trying to love somebody who's in addiction, you're sick and ill and grieving and going through a lot of things emotionally and mentally because of it. But we have to increase the compassion by being able to relate to any piece of what might be going on with this person. And sometimes it helps just to remember that they're a person. You know, this is someone's son, someone's daughter, or someone's father. But yeah, we have to reduce the stigma and shame and guilt that goes along with it.
I had to develop compassion myself because honestly, I didn't have it in the beginning. So I kind of did a 180 in that department.
And to be completely honest, so did I. It wasn't until I took the time to start to intentionally try learning about addiction, about recovery, and about that whole experience that I started to develop any real compassion for the people that were so affected by it. So I personally am very thankful for Miss Coffey and Miss Smith for taking the time to come help teach me about this and then letting me record that conversation so that we can try to teach you guys about this. So just so you guys know, Miss Lisa Coffey is now working at the Shepherd Shelter Ross Rehab in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. She used to be running her practice in Stanton and she had to close that down unfortunately, but she is still working in recovery. So for you listeners, if you want to have any more information on just the hard science of addiction from a medical perspective, you can go and listen to one of our past episodes with Dr. Cassis and Dr. Kinnan, where those two fully break down the biology and chemistry of both what's happening with addiction and then also some of the medicines used to help combat addiction. Well, that's all the time that we have for today, so let's go on and wrap this up. I would like to thank WSKV for broadcasting the show and also the Powell County Health Department for letting there be a show in the first place. And then most of all to Miss Coffey and Miss Smith, thank you guys for coming on. This is The Local Lens. I'm your host, Nate Brooks. These are our people using our voices, telling our stories, because no one sees it like we do.